My mother didn't even lower her voice when she said it. I know you paid off Jake's $45,000 in credit card debt, but we're giving him the lake cabin as his 30th birthday present. I was still holding the phone when she added, almost cheerfully, "And before you ask, no, you're not invited to the party." The room around me went quiet, in that sharp, unreal way, like every dollar I'd ever sacrificed had just evaporated at once. I turned to my grandmother, the only person who knew the truth, and asked, "You want to tell them, or should I?" Because 3 days later, nothing about their celebration looked the same. I grew up in a ranch-style house on the outskirts of Portland, the kind of place where neighbors kept to themselves and rain tapped steadily against the windows 9 months of the year. To most people, that house looked normal. Trimmed hedges, a basketball hoop in the driveway, my mother's seasonal wreaths on the front door. But inside, there was an order you learned early or you suffered for it. My mother, Patricia Coleman, a senior HR manager who prided herself on fairness at work, had a way of turning her version of events into gospel. She carried herself like someone who sacrificed everything for her children, even when the sacrifices were mine, not hers. My father, David Coleman, a soft-spoken accountant who worked long hours during tax season, mostly followed her lead. He rarely pushed back, not even when the truth bent so far it snapped. And then there was Jake, my younger brother, 3 years behind me but always miles ahead in my mother's eyes. He got the new gaming systems, the road trips to California, the car insurance paid through college. I got, "You're resourceful, you'll manage." She said it like a compliment, but it felt like abandonment wrapped in motivational speak. By the time I was 17, I understood the rules. Jake's problems came first, my father stayed neutral, and my mother ran our household like a production she refused to step down from directing. I worked weekends at a grocery store, saved for state college, and learned not to ask for things she'd already decided I could live without. Independence wasn't a choice, it was a requirement for survival. Years later, when I came home for Thanksgiving, I found my mother in the kitchen, stress baking at midnight. The counter was covered in failed pie crusts. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Nothing, just tired." But the next morning, while looking for coffee filters, I opened a drawer and found a stack of collection notices, all addressed to Jake. Medical bills, unpaid rent, credit card statements showing balances that made my stomach drop. The sight of them, ignored and multiplying, made something in my chest tighten. My brother was drowning in debt. And my mother, the woman who loved being seen as the family hero, hadn't told anyone. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom and did the math. I knew what I earned, what I could cut, and what it would cost me. Taking on Jake's debt meant my own plans, the down payment I'd been saving for, the graduate program I'd been considering, would have to wait, maybe for years. But watching my brother's credit collapse, knowing it would eventually pull my parents down with him, felt worse than any sacrifice I could make. So I stepped in, quietly, without fanfare. I consolidated his debts under my name, set up payment plans, and spent the next 18 months living like I was still making minimum wage. My mother never mentioned it again, except to take the credit.
3 days after that phone call, I found myself standing on the deck of my uncle's slate cabin, the same cabin I'd helped save. The air smelt like pine and charcoal, the same mix I'd grown up with during family summers. But this year, something in the atmosphere felt wrong, like everyone else was reading from a script I'd never been given. I spotted Jake, my 29-year-old brother, laughing with a cluster of cousins who already spoke as if the cabin were his. "When he takes it over," one of them said, "he should finally fix that dock. It's such a great property." Great property. The words tasted bitter. property I'd bled for while he partied through his 20s. Across the deck, my mother, Patricia, stood near the grill, gesturing animatedly as she told a story I'd heard versions of for years. Jake went through a rough patch, she said to my aunt and two family friends. But we pulled together as a family. I wasn't about to let him fall through the cracks. All I could do was stare at her. The confidence, the conviction, the absolute certainty that everyone would accept her version without questioning. And they did. Heads nodded, someone squeezed her arm sympathetically. No one asked who had actually paid the bills. My father, David, stood beside her, quiet as always, adding just enough supportive murmurs to make it seem like he remembered things the same way. I felt my jaw clench. 18 months of sacrifice had emptied my savings, postponed my dreams, and worn me down to nothing. And she stood there spinning a story polished enough to shine. Then came the real blow.
My cousin Rebecca, who worked in real estate law, pulled me aside. She lowered her voice. "Your mom's been asking about property transfers. She wants to put the cabin in Jake's name." She paused. "But there's a problem. Your grandmother's trust, the one she set up before she passed, it's blocking everything." The world came into sharp focus. The trust, the one I'd barely paid attention to when Grandma made me sign it 5 years ago, the one she'd insisted on just in case. I looked across the deck to where my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Margaret, sat in a folding chair, watching the crowd with that knowing, patient expression she wore when she'd already figured out what everyone else had missed. I walked over, the folder I'd brought tucked under my arm. I hadn't planned to use it. I'd brought it the way you bring insurance, hoping you won't need it, but prepared if you do. When I reached her side, I laid the folder on the small table and flipped it open. Payment receipts, debt consolidation papers, the trust documents with my name tied to every obligation, and, as it turned out, every right. Conversations around us quieted, one ripple at a time. Margaret cleared her throat. "Sarah, are you sure?" I wasn't sure about much anymore, but I was done being erased. I turned toward her, my voice low and steady. "You want to tell them?" I asked, "or should I?" Her eyes met mine, and that was the moment everything shifted. The night after the cabin gathering, I drove to my parents' house, expecting tension, maybe a difficult conversation. I didn't expect the coldness that greeted me, a strange, deliberate distance that felt rehearsed. My mother answered the door, but didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Jake's upset," she said flatly. "You've been talking to Margaret about the trust." I held her gaze. "I've been talking to Margaret about the truth." "This is family business, Sarah. You're making it complicated." "I made it simple," I said. "I paid Jake's debts. I saved him from bankruptcy. And now you're trying to give him a property I helped protect, without even acknowledging what I did." My mother's face hardened. "You didn't have to do that. No one asked you to." The words hit like a slap. "You're right," I said quietly. "No one asked. Because no one ever asks me. You just expect." Behind her, I saw my father hovering in the hallway, not close enough to intervene, but close enough to hear everything. His expression was unreadable. "The cabin was always meant for Jake," my mother said. "Your grandmother would have wanted him to have it." "Grandma set up a trust that says otherwise," I replied. "She tied the cabin to responsibility, to contribution, and that's not Jake." My mother's jaw tightened. "You're being selfish." I almost laughed. "I'm being selfish? I gave up 18 months of my life to save him. I delayed my own future. And you never even said thank you." She stepped back. "I think you should leave." I didn't argue. I just turned and walked to my car, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with every document spread out in front of me. Debt payments, the trust paperwork, correspondence with my grandmother before she passed, where she'd explicitly told me why she'd structured things this way. "Your mother has always had blind spots when it comes to Jake," she'd written. "This is to make sure you're protected." I picked up the phone and called the attorney my grandmother had recommended years ago. By noon, I had an appointment scheduled. 2 days later, I sat across from Thomas Brennan, a quiet man in his 60s who'd handled my grandmother's estate. He reviewed the documents with the kind of focus that made the air feel heavier. "Sarah," he said finally, "you have full authority here. The trust is ironclad. Your grandmother made sure of it." He explained the mechanics. The cabin couldn't be transferred without my approval. My contributions, financial and otherwise, gave me legal standing to block any changes. If my parents tried to go around me, I could contest it, and I'd win. "Once we file a formal objection," he said, "they'll have to acknowledge what you've done, publicly, legally. They won't be able to hide it anymore." 3 days later, I drove down the long gravel road to the cabin just as the morning sun broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Balloons were tied to the porch railing. Folding tables were set up on the line, covered with decorations in my mother's signature style. From a distance, it looked perfect, the kind of celebration she'd been planning for weeks. But halfway up the drive, a county vehicle was parked near the entrance. 2 officials stood on the porch steps, clipboards in hand. "Mrs. Coleman," one of them was saying as I approached, "we're here to deliver formal notice. This property is subject to a trust dispute. No transfer of ownership can proceed until the matter is legally resolved." My mother's face went pale. "There must be some mistake. This is a family gift. We own this cabin." The official shook his head. "According to the trust and the financial records attached, authority over this property rests with Sarah Coleman, not you." For a moment, she didn't understand, or maybe she refused to. "Who filed this?" she demanded, her voice rising. Her eyes swept the clearing and landed on me. The air between us went still. Before she could speak, another vehicle pulled up, a tow truck. It rolled to a stop near the edge of the lawn. The driver stepped out, checked his clipboard, and called out, "Jake Coleman?" My brother emerged from the cabin, confused. "That's me. Why?" "Your Jeep's being repossessed. Payments are 3 months behind." Jake's face went white. "Mom," but she couldn't fix it, not this time. There was no check she could write, no story she could spin fast enough to make this go away. The truck lifted the front end of his Jeep, the mechanical whine echoing across the property. Relatives who'd started arriving early for the party stopped in their tracks. Balloons swayed in the breeze. The whole scene felt surreal, a celebration collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. I stepped forward, calm in a way that surprised even me. Thomas Brennan, my attorney, pulled up behind me. Great Aunt Margaret walked at my side. My mother stared at me, her face flushed. "You did this?" I enforced the trust Grandma set up, nothing more. "This is Jake's birthday. He deserves this." "He didn't earn it, and you know it." "That doesn't matter." "It matters legally," Thomas interrupted, stepping forward. "Mrs. Coleman, your mother-in-law created this trust specifically to protect this property and to ensure it went to the family member who demonstrated responsibility. That person is Sarah." My father finally stepped onto the porch, rubbing his temples like he wanted to disappear. Everyone calm down. But he wasn't talking to my mother, he was talking to himself. Patricia pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. This trust was supposed to be temporary. It wasn't meant to give her control. That's not how trust agreements work, Thomas said gently. And your attempt to transfer the property without her knowledge triggered this review. Murmurs spread through the arriving guests. My cousin whispered loudly, Wait, Sarah paid off Jake's debts? Another relative frowned. For how long? My mother's expression cracked, not with guilt, but with the realization that her narrative was crumbling. That trust was for emergencies. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. Margaret stepped forward, her voice quiet but unshakable. Patricia, my sister set up that trust because she knew Jake would need protecting from himself, and she knew Sarah would be the one doing the protecting. She made sure Sarah had the authority to match the responsibility. My mother blinked rapidly, anger and panic fighting for space. This is still our family cabin. We built memories here. And I preserved it, I said softly. I just didn't realize you'd erase me to do it. She turned to my father, searching for backup, but he dropped his gaze. For once, even he couldn't pretend. Thomas opened the folder. Under the trust, Miss Coleman has full decision-making authority over this property. What happens next is her choice. My mother looked at me like I'd pulled the ground out from under her. What are you doing? She whispered. I'm setting boundaries, I said, something I should have done years ago. Behind her, I could see Jake, frozen on the porch steps. The same kid who'd never had to fight for anything, who'd never had to sacrifice, who'd been handed every advantage and squandered most of them. He looked small suddenly, lost. This cabin won't be transferred, I continued. Not until there's real accountability. Not until the truth stops being rewritten. You're punishing us, Jake said, his voice breaking. After everything Mom did for me? The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I took a breath. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm stopping you from being rewarded for something you didn't do. I'm your mother, Patricia said, her voice cracking. You can't do this to me. I didn't do anything, I said quietly. You did. The tow truck pulled away with Jake's Jeep. A balloon string snapped and drifted into the trees. A banner that read Happy 30th Jake sagged in the middle. Guests were leaving now, murmuring apologies, pretending they'd forgotten something at home. The perfect day my mother had imagined, her triumphant gift, her golden child's celebration, had collapsed under the weight of the truth she'd tried so hard to bury. Patricia took a small, unsteady step backward. My father caught her elbow. Jake stood still, finally silent. I turned to leave, Margaret and Thomas walking beside me. The breeze carried the faint rustle of the banner behind me. Their big day wasn't ruined. It was rewritten. In the weeks that followed, everything settled into a quieter, truer shape. The trust review confirmed exactly what Thomas had predicted. My grandmother's intentions were clear. The cabin would remain under my authority until I decided otherwise. Every payment I'd made, every sacrifice I'd shouldered was documented and legally recognized. My parents didn't fight it. Not really. My mother packed up their things from the cabin in silence, her movements tight and mechanical. My father helped, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact whenever I stopped by to collect my own belongings. Jake, stripped of the gift he'd assumed was already his, finally got a steady job. He started paying his own bills. Slowly, with difficulty, but he did it. When I saw him at a coffee shop months later, he didn't wave. He just gave me a small nod, not quite an apology, but closer than he'd ever come. As for me, I kept the cabin. I spent weekends there, fixing the dock, repainting the shutters, sitting on the porch with my grandmother's photo on the table beside me. It felt strange at first, claiming something I'd protected for so long, but never truly believed could be mine. Strange and peaceful. Standing on that porch now, I finally understand something I spent years avoiding. Protecting yourself isn't betrayal. It's the first honest form of love you learn when the people who should have cared for you choose convenience over truth. I didn't win a victory over my family. I simply stepped out of the shadow they kept me in. If you've ever carried everything alone or been written out of your own story, you're not alone. Share your experience in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.